Thank you very much for the organizers to give me the chance to speak during this conference and have the keynote speech. I'm really honored to be invited by the organizers, and I'm especially delighted to speak in this exact room, because on the other side of this wall here is my old grammar school situated, where I have spent 4 years, I think my best 4 years in my life. Before I start my keynote speech, I must apologize because I will speak Hungarian. The organizers asked me specifically to speak Hungarian, so now I will switch to Hungarian, but there is a translation. Tisztelt Hölgyeim és Uraim, kedves kollégák! Megtiszteltetés számomra, hogy önökkel, a nemzetközi kapcsolatok ismert szakértőivel megoszthatok néhány gondolatot biztonsági környezetünk értékelésével kapcsolatban. Annyi bizonyos, hogy az utóbbi néhány évben, és különösen a mögöttünk hagyott esztendőben jelentős változások tanúi lehetünk a világban. Az egypólusú világrend véget érni látszik, és ma már sokak számára a fő kérdés az, hogy új hidegháborús korszakba lépünk-e vagy sem. A kérdés megválaszolásához elemeznünk kell többek között a nyugat elleni fenyegetéseket. Mindenki egyetért abban, hogy a nyugat biztonsági környezete jelentősen megváltozott. Mondjuk ki, romlott. Ezért nyomás nehezedik ránk, hogy újra gondoljuk egész biztonságpolitikai felfogásunkat, újraírjuk stratégiai dokumentumainkat. Keleten Oroszország egyre határozottabban lép fel, pontosabban fogalmazva egyre agresszívebben érvényesíti akaratát, ami ma aktuálisan elsősorban Ukrajnát sújtja. Délen pedig az ISIS létrejöttével egy brutális terrorista szervezkedés született, amely állami funkciókra tör, ráadásul katonailag igen hatékonyan működik. Mivel a jelen konferencia fő témája az Egyesült Államok és Oroszország közötti konfliktus, engedjék meg, hogy először az orosz fenyegetés miatt kialakult realitásokat vegyem szemügyre. Nehéz ellenállni a kísértésnek, hogy az Oroszországgal kialakult konfliktust ne címkézzük meg valamiféle új hidegháborúként. A sajtóban sokan ezt is teszik. A néhány évvel ezelőtti, mondjuk a 2008-as helyzettel ellentétben nem mondhatjuk, hogy Oroszország csak a posztszovjet térség országaira nézve jelent potenciális fenyegetést. Aggodalomra ad okot a NATO keleti határain lévő néhány szövetségesünk, különösen Litvánia, Lettország és Észtország, de talán még Lengyelország esetleges fenyegetettsége is. Sőt, a potenciális orosz fenyegetés nem korlátozódik a NATO keleti határaira. Az elmúlt hetek provokációi után svéd és finn partnereink sem érezhetik magukat biztonságban úgy, ahogy azt a Szovjetunió széthullását követően remélték. A nyugat ebben a helyzetben nem engedheti meg magának, hogy kudarcot valljon biztonságának szavatolása terén. A walesi NATO csúcson példás egységben meg is hozta a szükséges döntéseket. Az elmondottak ellenére meggyőződésem, hogy az orosz agresszivitás önmagában nem elegendő ahhoz, hogy új hidegháborúként értékeljük a kialakult helyzetet. Egy új hidegháború kialakulásának számos, viszonylag objektív feltétele van. Ilyen feltétel többek között az, hogy két globális érdekérvényesítő képességgel rendelkező szuperhatalom álljon szemben egymással. Oroszország azonban nem felel meg a másik pólus követelményeinek. Oroszország nukleáris arzenájának megőrzése mellett sem szuperhatalom, sokkal inkább regionális nagyhatalom, a modernizációs kudarc, a viszonylag alacsony gazdasági teljesítmény, a költségvetés túlzott energiaexport függősége, a most ugyan némiképp javuló tendenciát mutató, de hosszabb távon mégis negatív népesedési trendek és más okok miatt. Oroszország egyszerűen nem elég erős ahhoz, hogy új hidegháborút generálhasson. Sőt, Oroszország a nyugattal folytatott konfliktus hatására várhatóan tovább fog gyengülni. Oroszország mozgásterét az is jelentősen korlátozza, hogy beavatkozásai számláját állnia kell. De az igazán komoly veszélyt számára a palagáz forradalom jelenti, ami az állami bevételei alapját rendítheti meg már középtávon is. A kortárs Oroszország orientációs választás előtt áll. Bár a nyugati orientáció jobban szolgálná az orosz érdekeket, mint a kapcsolatok szorosabbra fűzése Kínával, egyelőre Oroszország kelet felé fordulással igyekszik a nyugattal kialakult konfliktusa következményeit ellensúlyozni. Oroszország valószínűleg sohasem fog olyan mértékben integrálódni a nyugati világba, ahogy azt a kelet-közép-európai államok tették. Én azonban hiszek abban, hogy ez hosszabb távon mégsem zárja ki a nyugat és Oroszország együttműködését. A nyugati világ vezető hatalma, az Egyesült Államok globális befolyása továbbra is erős, de már nem megkérdőjelezhetetlen. A gyorsan fejlődő Kelet és Dél-Ázsia, az USA és általában véve a nyugat igazi riválisa. Ma még nyitott kérdés, hogy a formálódó új ázsiai szuperhatalom, esetleg szuperhatalmak, és a nyugat viszonyát az együttműködés vagy a szembenállás fogja-e meghatározni a jövőben. Reméljük az előbbi, de semmit sem lehet kizárni. Itt nem kizárt egy új hidegháború. Engedjék meg, hogy megosszak önökkel néhány gondolatot korunk másik, megkerülhetetlen biztonsági kihívásáról, az iszlám fundamentalizmus és radikalizmus terjedéséről. A szélsőséges iszlám mozgalmak jelentette fenyegetés nem új jelenség, a nyugat már évtizedek óta küzd ellene. Ezek a radikális erők, akik persze csak a népesség kisebb felét képviselik, kihasználják bizonyos észak-afrikai és közel-keleti államok strukturális gyengeségeit. Emiatt a demokratikusnak induló forradalmak a térség legtöbb országában nem váltották be a hozzájuk fűzött reményeket, és negatív fordulatot vettek. Az iszlám világ jelentős államainak esetleges további radikalizálódása beláthatatlan következményekkel járhat. Az iszlám államok jó része gazdasági értelemben véve stagnál, népességük ugyanakkor gyorsan növekszik, ami már önmagában is egy nagyon veszélyes kombináció. Az iszlám radikalizmus ráadásul a nyugatot dekadensnek tartja, miközben önmaga morális felsőbbrendűségét hirdeti. Ezek így együtt, ahogy ezt már számos történelmi példa megmutatta, jelentik a nyugati világ elleni igazi kihívást. Ki kell mondanunk, hogy az iszlám radikalizmus terjedése hosszabb távon egzisztenciális fenyegetést jelenthet nem csak a közel-kelet államai számára, hanem a nyugat, és azon belül elsősorban Európa számára is. Ennek megfelelően a radikális iszlám fenyegetés elleni küzdelem, különösképpen az iszlám állam elleni harc napjainkra kulcsfontosságúvá vált. Összességében meggyőződésem, hogy hosszú távon mindenképpen, de már középtávon is a radikális iszlám jelentette kihívás sokkal komolyabb fenyegetést jelent a nyugat számára, mint Oroszország. Ahogy korábban utaltam rá, Oroszország valójában nem erősödik, hanem gyengül. Ez azonban rövid és középtávon egy rendkívül veszélyes állapot, hiszen a sarokba szorított medve a legveszélyesebb. Ezt a helyzetet a nyugatnak nagy bölcsességgel, higgadtan, ugyanakkor erőt és elszántságot felmutatva kell kezelnie. Köszönöm szépen megtisztelő figyelmüket!
Mr. Shikloshi, thank you very much for your speech. Our first panel, titled The Creation of the Contemporary World Order Through the Prism of Cold War History, will begin shortly. Please join me in welcoming our panelists and the panelist moderator, Dr. Ferenc Hörher, head of the Institute of Philosophy at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Hörher, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It's a great honor and pleasure to be the chair of this first session, which is really interesting as far as the topic and as far as the participants are concerned too. And I'm really happy to be here at this occasion in general, because I think that it's an important event in the history of the new Hungarian democracy, because the center itself that organizes the event, the Antall József Knowledge Center, is named after our first Prime Minister, the late József Antall, who was a key figure in the fall of the Iron Curtain, and I think a key figure in the international dialogue between the East and the West. Located in Central Europe, Hungary has a history which is quite astonishingly diverse and under different influences of foreign powers from the East and West. And as soon as we got into the position of regaining independence in 1990, we had to realize how dangerous a world this free world is. So it is really, it was one of the key issues that the late Prime Minister József Antall called our attention to, was that we have to look around in the world, try to make sense of the different inspirations, influences that come from the West, that come from the East, and try to bridge the two fields. And I think this is an occasion when this can happen, because we have got experts from all over the world, from the US, from Russia, from Hungary, and from Britain in this first panel. And I think it will be an important, an interesting conversation. We plan to organize it in the following way. Each presenter will present a short presentation in 15 to 20 minutes. And then we will have a round for each other to comment and question each other. And then we open up the floor for questions and comments for the audience. It should be within 2 hours, the session. And let me introduce first our first speaker, Professor András Balog, who is a professor at the Department of Modern and Contemporary History of Eötvös Loránd University, Budapest University. He is a researcher focusing on international relations, contemporary history of South and Southeast Asian societies. He also worked as an ambassador for 25 years in different countries around the world, and he was a participant of the process which led to the Hungarian accession to the EU between 1995 and 1998. Professor Balog, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience, it is really a great pleasure for me to have got this invitation to the Knowledge Center named after our first Prime Minister, József Antall. I think that it is really, unfortunately, a unique, almost exceptional forum, the Knowledge Center, organized now. Why? Because unfortunately nowadays we see very few fora, gatherings, academic conferences even, where different people, different persons, different views are being represented. That's why that I am very grateful to the director of the Knowledge Center, very old acquaintance and friend of mine. About 10 years ago, even later, we organized together our foundations, which were very similar, which in Germany, the Friedrich Hebert and Naumann and many other foundations work. Unfortunately, even this tradition could not continue. So, thank you very much for the topic, the Cold War, which we are really very much interested in, for different reasons. Those who who are not too young, like me, spent many decades just in the conditions of the Cold War. We were participants, active or not so active participants of that period. And today, again, it is a very unfortunately fashionable topic, whether the Cold War may or will return. What is the Cold War? I think that will be the first part of my presentation. The second one is just talking about the possibility or inevitability or necessity of the return of the Cold War. And the third one is certain conclusions. I wholeheartedly join the Secretary of State, whose thoughts are a very valuable contribution to the topic, generally speaking. And so, especially when he tried to keep a good balance between the historical facts and the dangers and also the hopes and, of course, expectations. Ladies and gentlemen, my views concerning the Cold War are a bit unconventional. First of all, because I think that the Cold War united and combined two different aspects. One is the cooperation, the other the confrontation. To forget about the confrontation side of the Cold War, it would be a tremendous mistake. Very rarely happens, because now we are again emphasizing, even overemphasizing, the confrontation side of the whole Cold War period for different reasons. I think that's one of the reasons that we see again the re-emergence of certain aspects which are similar to the Cold War. The second one probably comes from our age, because those people who are, of course, I talk first of all about myself. So we spent too much time in the Cold War, we studied the Cold War period, and probably our way of thinking is too much determined by the traditions, the rules, the dangers of the Cold War. So when I'm talking about the confrontation period, I think that it is useless to give examples for this, because usually now we put the stress just on this side of the matter. At the same time, just that we clarify the totality, entirety of the entire Cold War period, it is that, please, we must not forget about the strong and basic cooperation between the two superpowers. Because the Cold War is very clearly, it is the manifestation of the relationship of the two superpowers. It is a bipolar system we are talking about. It is clearly, that's one of the fundamental basic features of it. What was the exact relationship between the two superpowers, their allies, their satellites? You can call other different names of those who sometimes are really those who follow blindly the various orders, sometimes they voluntarily accepted. Anyway, the cooperative side of the Cold War, it is very important to remember. First of all, we must remember that the two superpowers together were fighting the Second World War. And as a continuation of this period, the wartime alliance, especially between 45, the beginning of 47, because the periods are very important. So we see that in a lot of fields, the two superpowers work together very well. The management of international affairs, the treatment of those who had been defeated during the war, decision concerning the fate of the world, and especially Europe, was very much a common endeavor. Please remember that the partition of the world, and what is really very painful for the Europeans, the partition of Europe, it was a common business. And in this period, the new borders, which were not only political, geographical borders, but political, ideological borders at the same time. Again, it was a joint venture. Please don't forget about this kind of cooperation in case of anti-system, anti-alliance revolts. Please remember how the Hungarians had to face with this reality in 1956, how the Greeks shared more or less the same fate after the Second World War, during the Civil War, where it was extremely clear evidence of this kind of a cooperation. Also, I must emphasize that the common interests were manifest clearly in the creation of the new international organizations, including the United Nations. The structure, the competence of the United Nations were clearly a common interest of the big powers. Please don't forget about some common interests concerning the support of the independence movements in Asia, Africa, and in some other parts of the world. It was a common interest of Washington and Moscow to give or help or assist the freedom struggles in the world, which later became the Third World. Even such events as the establishment of Israel, clearly there is evidence of the cooperation between the American and the Soviet interests. So, what else? I think that later, the preservation of the status quo, nobody liked it, and nobody wanted to destroy the system, evidently. There were certain challenges against the system, but basically there was a common interest of West and East to keep the status quo in Europe, and also between the two superpowers. That's why that I can give you a clear example of this cooperation concerning the real confrontations between the two blocs. And one thing I think that we must remember very clearly, the two superpowers, although they were permanently in a total disagreement with each other, they participated in a lot of absolutely violent and bloody conflicts in different parts of the world, but they never were fighting against each other a hot war. You cannot tell me any evidence of a direct military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union in this period. And the cooperative fields were very clearly manifest in the various peace negotiations, the summits. Sometimes it was a very risky period. Perhaps some of you remember the Korean War, also the Cuba and the Caribbean crisis, which probably were the most risky periods in the Cold War history. But with certain exceptions, the establishment of the acceptable relationship between Washington and Moscow have never been undermined. That's an important part, and also lessons we must very clearly remember of the Cold War period. So the question is whether if we give a definition of the Cold War, do we see that during the Cold War, this type of a coexistence existed? We can call it peaceful or not so peaceful, but it was clearly that such important ideas dominated the sea, which had been formulated by Kennan. Kennan was one of the most important thinkers in the history of the United States on the field of foreign politics. And many who studied history in the eastern part of the world thought and was taught that George Kennan was some sort of a warmonger. Not at all. Actually, these were the clear indication that the two superpowers agreed in some sort of a division of responsibility, division of the world, and it worked quite well. Of course, not everybody liked it, especially not the Central Europeans, and many others, of course, had a lot of reservations, a lot of rejections, a lot of objections. That's clear. But this Cold War area was characterized by a lot of features we tend not to remember, not to build these lessons in our way of thinking. So when we are talking about the conditions of the Cold War period, the superpower balance, Secretary of State was very right that it depended on many factors. One of the factors was some sort of a real balance between the two superpowers. How was it balanced, the relationship? That's a different question. On military field, actually, that's the most evident that existed. On the field of economy, on the field of demography, and many others, the situation is much more complicated. Now, I don't want to give you difficult figures concerning the Cold War area, but you must remember that between the United States and the Soviet Union, economically, of course, there was not any balance similar that of the military field. But the difference usually between the 50s and 70s, it was about 50-60% of the economic performance of the Soviet Union reached the American, which is rather big, and especially if you take into consideration that the United States were much better positioned internationally. West European countries' strengths could not be compared with the East European ones, the lies. In East Asia, Japan, and many other parts of the world, the Americans had a clear advantage. At the same time, it is also significant to know that between the 50s and 70s, mid-70s, it was a wonderful period of economic growth of the world in this period. Some say that that was the golden age of capitalism. That's true. 4, 5, 6% growth was characteristic to the United States and Western Europe. Some people say that it was the Keynesian model, so that functioned so well. At the same time, we must remember also that that was an unprecedented growth, economically speaking, in the Soviet Union as well. So it means that more or less the economic strength remains static, with the well-known problems which especially after the 70s were so manifest. The Soviet Union's economy, foreign trade, and many important economic indicators demonstrated that the Soviet Union structure economically, also in the international trade, was similar to the third world country. The export structure of the Soviet Union was absolutely unbalanced. The Soviet Union was mainly raw material and energy resources exporter. Again, that was a characteristic feature that the agriculture remained absolutely behind the American level. Ladies and gentlemen, after the end of the Cold War, I use mainly those figures which generally in the academic works are so significant. World Bank, IMF figures, the CIA fact book, in military affairs, mainly the CIPRI and other figures we usually accept. The differences are clear. At the same time, I must tell you that in 1990, the Soviet and the American GDP remained stagnant in comparison with each other. What happened after, and I think that you know this story very well, and I don't want to cite and quote you many figures. One is clearly so that in 2013, now Russia's geography, demography, economic performance, and many other figures show the advantage of the Americans in every field, actually. And today, I mean that last year's figures show that even the growth rates are totally different in favor of the Americans. The GDP of the Americans in the world is more than 27%. In case of Russia, it is a bit more than 3%, 3.37%. So it is a clear disadvantage for the Russians. That's why to the question whether we can return to the Cold War area, I say that is impossible. So the figures are totally different. The Americans have got a real advantage. And Russia, in the foreseeable future, cannot be competitive to the Americans. It is clearly so. Ladies and gentlemen, all the important figures and facts indicate that now if we draw conclusions, it is clear that the Cold War positions not to be recreated, regenerated. It is out of question at the moment. Now it is clear that the Americans, together with the Allies, have got much better and much more pleasant conditions. At the same time, it is clear that the return to the Cold War, even if we redefine the Cold War it is impossible. So out of question, it is no longer a problem. At the same time, the management of the Russian question, it is one of the most vital for the actors and students of international politics. There is a strong paradox in Europe. One is that the European integration cannot be achieved, cannot be perfect without the involving of Russia in some way. It is one side of the paradox. The second one, at the moment, Russia cannot be integrated into the European structures. In the long run, it is impossible to keep this situation for. And now again a question, whether the bipolarism is totally out of question. What about China? China can replace Russia in a bipolar game? I think that's not. Studying the Chinese positions, geopolitical positions, also the figures, it is clear that China is not the same as Russia was. One important factor I want to underline. Russia was an ideological political power with a lot of allies in the different parts of the world. Was a very much hostile country to the bulk of the population in the West. At the same time, today, Russia doesn't enjoy this kind of attraction to those who supported the anti-establishment positions in the West. China today is not an attractive country for the outsiders. China doesn't have any ideological attraction or force to anybody in the world. China is isolated even in Southeast Asia. So, as a conclusion, I think that we must not think that the world is totally safe from the various security challenges. But please don't forget, in the last 25 years, for the community of the security considerations, always there was an open question, which are the new challenges? That was our mania in the last 25 years, always to find the new kind of challenges. And we enlisted 15, 20, 25 different challenges in the meantime. Sometimes the national minorities were the main responsible for the instability. Sometimes the economic gap in the various societies. Sometimes the challenge of the non-European nations. Sometimes the terrorism, different forms of terrorism, and of course the traditional terrorism. As far as the Ukrainian problem concerned, which is really very much on the agenda in the forefront, I think that even 20 years ago, we knew exactly well that Ukraine in this form, it is a destabilizing factor. We must find some sort of solution. It is clear that only together, jointly, those who are interested in the stabilization and stability of Ukraine, we can find any solution. One thing is clear, that for Europe there are many challenges, and one thing is that without some sort of a settlement with Russia, we are open to the various challenges.
Thank you, Professor Blau. I think that would be a nice final word.
Yes, of course. I know that this topic probably it is too much.
We are just running out of time. That's
and of course, I wanted to give only roughly the thesis, the main thesis, what I wanted to say, without the figures and without further explanations. Thank you very much for your patience and tolerance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Balog. I just have to keep to the time, and that was all that I wanted to show. And it was really a challenge that you presented for the audience, for our next discussant, the next participants claiming that the Cold War was more of a cooperational and rather cooperational than confrontational. Let's see how the others see. The next speaker is Professor Mark Kramer from the Cold War Studies program of Davis Center, Harvard University. He is the director of the center and a senior fellow of it. And his main interest is in Cold War history, international relations, comparative politics, Soviet and East European history. He published a number of books on these topics, including Czechoslovakia in 1968, including the upheavals in Poland and Hungary, and the crisis in the communist world in general. And his talk today is Understanding the Cold War in Retrospect, Public Memory versus Historical Research. Professor Kramer, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's good to be back here in Budapest, particularly because I was a real admirer of Prime Minister Antall. I think he played a very important role at the beginning of the post-Cold War period, and so I'm very pleased in that respect. It was also 20 years ago this year that I received a faculty grant to learn Hungarian, and I underwent an intensive course in Hungarian in the summer of 1994. And even though my understanding of Hungarian is still very limited, I am able to read it and have actually worked in the archives here. I may, from time to time here, need to use the translation set, but I hope to get the practice of doing without it. So let me, I'm going to be speaking about the same period that András has covered, but I will be speaking about it from a different angle. And I have deliberately structured the PowerPoint presentation because unlike the vast majority of people in the room, I am a native English speaker, whereas I realize that for non-native speakers, it can be better to have more text presented of what I am saying. So I have deliberately tried to do that, and I hope that you are able to see the screen. In dealing with my own students, I would probably put in things like photographs and maps and the like, but I have not done that here. So, whoops. Well, let me, I hope that I will be able to control this a little better. But the term Cold War, I just want to start with a very short definition. It's already been implicit in much of what András said. But the term Cold War refers to the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States that lasted from roughly the first 45 years after the end of the Second World War. Of course, many other countries were involved, but it was primarily about these two countries. The term Cold War predates the Cold War itself. It's actually been traced to as far back as the 1930s. But it was first widely popularized after the Second World War by the American journalist Walter Lippmann in his commentaries in the New York Herald Tribune. Two features of the Cold War distinguished it from other periods in modern history. First, It involved a fundamental clash of secular ideologies. There, of course, had been clashes between religious ideologies in the past, but this entailed a fundamental clash of secular ideologies, that is Marxism-Leninism on the Soviet side versus liberal democracy on the American side. These were ideologies. It's not to say that either country ever fully abided by them or tried to live by them per se, but they were the ideologies involved, ways of attracting and influencing others. And the second feature, which again, both of these features are essential, neither one on its own would be sufficient, was there was a highly stratified global power structure in which the United States and the Soviet Union were seen as being in a distinct class of countries, the so-called superpowers, who were preeminent over all other countries. The recent tensions over Ukraine have sparked concerns about a new Cold War, so-called, with Russia today. And the point I want to focus on here is to dispel some of the mythology around the Cold War and the often nostalgic view of it that sets in, I think, by people who take much too glib and often inaccurate account of what the Cold War was really about. The Cold War led to numerous crises and wars, spurred the two sides to deploy immense military forces, including tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. There are still many of these nuclear weapons left today. All of that is a direct legacy of the Cold War. 25 years, though, have passed, and what is sometimes unnerving for people like me and others on the panel and in some on other panels here is that numerous myths about it tend to endure. So let me look. The first one would be the Cold War was a long peace. Andras alluded to this in talking about that the United States and the Soviet Union did not engage in a large-scale war directly. Soviet troops did, in fact, take part in the disguise of being Chinese in the Korean War. Whether you would regard that as a direct military clash, I think, is doubtful. But still, it is true that as the characterization of the Cold War as a long peace, a term coined by John Lewis Gaddis at Yale University, who was then at Ohio University in the 1980s. That term makes sense only if we overlook the large number of devastating wars that resulted from, or at least were greatly aggravated by, the Cold War. I have mentioned these here: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, civil wars in Central America and Southern Africa, a succession of wars in the Middle East, wars in South Asia, particularly between China and India, the Soviet war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. These cumulatively resulted in the deaths of some 22 million people, which again it depends on whose perspective you're taking, but certainly from the perspective of the large majority of people on Earth, the Cold War was not a long peace at all. It was a time of significant bloodshed and remarkable violence. Let me say millions of other people, though, as a result of the Cold War, were slaughtered by their own governments that came to power in the Cold War context, particularly in Mao Zedong's China and in Pol Pot's Cambodia, where we're talking about millions or even tens of millions. Large numbers also died in governments in Latin America and African states that were backed by the United States and other Western governments because of Cold War pressures. So again, the notion of a long peace, I think, glosses over all of this. And let me then turn to myth number 2, which was the Cold War was a time of international stability and predictability. And the end of it has spawned new threats and uncertainty. To some extent, some of this came up a bit in the opening address this morning. But the notion of the Cold War is a time of stability and predictability. Here, as one example of this, I single out David Ignatius because I actually think he's a very good columnist for the Washington Post. He published an article in May 2007 in which he claimed, and again, I quote from him here, "The bipolar world of the Cold War had an inherent stability. The two superpowers understood the rules of the game," unquote. In the post-Cold War world, Ignatius argued, quote, "we inhabit a world that makes the Cold War seem like the good old days," unquote. This is the type of nostalgic misrepresentation of the Cold War that really infuriates me, even though I happen to like David Ignatius personally. But the reality is that stability during the Cold War was often non-existent. Dangerous crises repeatedly emerged, including numerous ones I have no time to get into, but starting with showdowns over Turkey and Iran right after World War II, the Berlin blockade of 1948-1949, when the United States still possessed a monopoly of nuclear weapons, but Stalin initiated that crisis anyway. The Quemoy and Matsu crises of the 1950s between Communist China and the United States. The New Berlin crises in the late 1950s and especially the early 1960s, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world perilously close to nuclear war. It still amazes me as I look at the declassified records today to see how lucky in many ways the world was to have avoided nuclear war in October 1962. There were many small things that could have gone wrong that would have led to a disastrous outcome. The prospect of nuclear war during the Cold War reemerged in 1969 when Soviet and Chinese troops fought each other along their border. We're coming up to an anniversary of that, and I hope there will be materials released in connection with that. Very little has been released so far. But US and Chinese troops fought each other in Korea in the early 1950s, a war that killed more than 2 million people. Both Chinese and Soviet military forces took part in operations against US forces during the Vietnam War. Soviet personnel manned air defense batteries. These were hardly the good old days that Ignatius was referring to. So let me then turn, because he goes on to talk about the new threats that he sees as having emerged. But quite apart from the wars and destabilizing crises that were a regular feature of the Cold War, the threats that he and others often see as new nowadays are not new at all. They arose during the Cold War, in some cases even predated the Cold War. The average annual number of international terrorist attacks, whether you measure it by individual incidents, by numbers killed, by other indicators you could use, was higher in the late 1960s and early 1970s than it has been since 1989. In fact, it is much higher. Again, I can provide the data if people are interested in later in approaching me. I don't have time now. In the span of just a year, in 1971, 1972, for example, the Palestinian terrorist group Black September that had just taken shape, that in 1971. Black September orchestrated a long series of spectacular terrorist attacks, including the assassination of the Jordanian Prime Minister Wasfi-Tal, the simultaneous hijacking of 4 passenger aircraft, 3 of which were blown up, numerous other hijackings, a massacre at Israel's Lod Airport. It was perpetrated by the Japanese Red Army, but with the assistance and at the behest of Black September. And then, perhaps most notoriously of all, the murder of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics later in 1972. No comparable string of international attacks in such a short time has happened in the post-Cold War era. Almost all of the terrorist groups during the Cold War were armed and funded by the Soviet bloc, including by Hungary, much more so by countries like East Germany, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. Throughout the 1980s as well, international terrorist groups, in fact, if we want to understand some of the roots of Islamic fundamentalism today, you can go back to two signal events, one being the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the other being the Soviet invasion at the end of that same year, a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and all the consequences it had. The Islamic Jihad carried out grisly attacks, including the bombing of the US Marine barracks in Lebanon in October 1983, the destruction of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie in late 1988. So terrorism is not new at all, or it's certainly not a new feature of the Cold War. It was there during the Cold War. It's just that the United States didn't deem it as the overriding threat that it did see it as after September 2001. The same is true about nuclear proliferation, and again, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to go through this quite quickly. But to say the spread of nuclear weapons has been present from the time the first bomb was detonated in July initially as a test, and then over Japan in August, the 2 bombs in August of 1945. The United States would be seen as the first country to acquire, and was the first country to acquire nuclear weapons. But US policymakers were concerned about almost all of the countries that followed. Britain would be the main exception, and France would be a partial exception of countries that the United States simply accepted as members of the nuclear club. But in all other instances, starting with the Soviet Union's acquisition of nuclear weapons in August 1949, this problem existed all during the Cold War. So great was US concern about China's impending acquisition of nuclear weapons in 1964 that US policymakers considered launching preemptive strikes against China's facilities, just as they considered launching preemptive strikes against the facilities of Iran more recently, though whether that will ever be done, I think, is extremely unlikely. The Soviet Union, similarly in 1969, during the conflicts with China, contemplated much the same. The rate of nuclear proliferation, the incidence of it, was substantially greater during the Cold War than it has been in the post-Cold War period. The number of nuclear-armed countries during the Cold War eventually grew to 8. 6 of these tested nuclear weapons openly. I include India here because even though India described its detonation in 1974 as a peaceful nuclear device, the only difference between a peaceful nuclear device and a regular nuclear bomb is that you call it a peaceful nuclear device. There is no other technological difference. So there were 6 openly, and then 2 countries that secretly acquired nuclear weapons, Israel and South Africa. That's a rate of 8 countries. In other words, you're talking about 8 countries over 45 years, between 5 and 6 years per country. In the post-Cold War era, one of those countries, South Africa, gave up all its nuclear weapons and dismantled its program. So far, there have been only 2 new countries. Iran is hoping to make a third, but isn't there yet. Pakistan and North Korea have openly tested nuclear weapons. So that means there's been a net increase of 1 nuclear weapon state since 1989, a period now of 25 years. During the Cold War, by contrast, it was 1 every 5 to 6 years. So nuclear proliferation, too, was a serious problem during the Cold War, one that in many ways was at least as difficult to come to terms with. It certainly isn't new. And then, let me very briefly, because I need to finish within a few minutes, is during the Cold War, the West knew exactly who the enemy was. And the problem now in the post-Cold War period is the enemy seems to change, whether it becomes Islamic radicals or now Russia or in some other respects. In fact, the same sort of thing is exactly what happened during the Cold War, that the main enemy would fluctuate over time. In the late 1940s, American communists were often seen as those of greatest immediate concern. The Soviet Union during Stalin's lifetime also served that function. But then after Stalin died and his relations gradually improved, China came to occupy that role in the 1950s and 1960s. And it wasn't until the rapprochement of the early 1970s that changed. Similarly, debates about whether the United States should be combating insurgents in Vietnam or insurgents in Central America or supporting other insurgents in Central America. All of those debates rested on a lack of a real certainty about who the enemy was. So with that, I'm going to have to end. Suffice it simply to say that the actual history of the Cold War should not induce a nostalgia about it. Should make people, I think, very happy that it's over, and shouldn't be something we want to return now. I do feel, and this is my final point, is that what we're talking about now would not be anything like the global, highly militarized confrontation and ideologically charged confrontation of the Cold War. It would be much more of a regional dispute between one set of countries that has its own notion and then another country, another great power that has its own particular notion of how that region should be won. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for taking care of our time as well. And let me just shortly refer to the main points of your talk, which was that there is a danger of a nostalgia for the Cold War, and the three myths that seem to me quite convincingly proven that might be mistaken is a long peace, a period of stability, and one period when the enemy was clear. And now let's turn to our third speaker today, who is Vladimir Pechanov, professor of international relations at the European and American Studies Department of Moscow State University of International Relations. And he also has a distinguished career as our earlier speaker as foreign affairs official, as he was the first secretary and counselor of the Russian embassy in Washington between 1987 and 1994. But he also held different research positions, like at the Woodrow Wilson Center and in Canada as well. And he published extensively on early Cold War history, and his main research interests are US political history and the history of the US-Soviet-Russian relations. Professor Pechanov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the organizers of this conference. It's nice to be back here in Budapest after so many years and to find this city more cheerful and more beautiful than in the grim early 1980s, when was my first visit here. I'm planning to talk about the continuity and change between the Cold War and now. Fortunately, the previous speakers have made my task easier because they have clearly shown how different the real Cold War was from the current crisis. Let me only add to these differences a couple of points which I think are worth mentioning. First of all, this new asymmetry of power, which Mr. Secretary and Mr. Ambassador alluded to. That's an obvious fact, but the effect of that asymmetry is that it enhances Russia's sense of vulnerability and at the same time encourages the other side to be more assertive and offensive. Two other differences are also important in my view. First of all, there is a greater trade and economic interdependence between Russia and the West, particularly Europe, and much greater integration of Russia into world economy. That mutual dependence serves as an important constraint on both sides. Second, Russia is not isolated from the outside world in cultural, informational, and human contact terms. In the age of internet, there is no and can be no Iron Curtain anymore. The implications of this change are complex and numerous, but in any case, this new environment is not conducive to the restoration of total control and mobilization of the Soviet Cold War times. Third, there is also a new cultural dimension to this conflict, especially when you look at it from inside Russia. Instead of clash of official ideologies, which Mark alluded to, we have a value gap, a clash of popular cultures, if you wish, in which permissive Western postmodern liberalism faces traditionalist, collectivist, statist, yes, and orthodox Russian conservatism. This tends to expand the popular base of confrontation policies and make it more difficult for politicians on both sides to change gears and to move away from confrontation to cooperation. Let me now turn to the continuity and similarities between these two eras. The most important one, in my view, is geopolitical rivalry. Back in mid-40s, the Cold War in Europe originated in the struggle for spheres of influence, especially in Eastern and Central Europe, where World War II left huge power vacuums. Moscow then wanted to close this traditional corridor of aggression from the West by setting up friendly pro-Soviet governments along its western border. United States and United Kingdom could agree to a certain extent to have this area in the Soviet sphere of interest, provided if this would be an open sphere of influence, heavily dependent upon the Soviet side in the military and foreign policy sense, but open to Western ideas, capital, goods, etc. But Washington and London could not, both for strategic and domestic policy reasons, could not agree to this area to become part of Soviet-led military political bloc. We all know what the result of this. The partition of Germany and of the whole Europe into two heavily armed camps, which lasted for more than 40 years. The end of the Cold War and the retreat of Soviet military presence from Central and Eastern Europe, coupled with the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself, created new power vacuums on this huge post-Soviet space, thus opening the ground for a new competition for influence. The key difference from the Russian point of view was that back in the 40s, it was about Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Now it was about Baltics, Ukraine, and Caucasus, much closer to the Russian heartland. No wonder Russia is much more sensitive to that challenge than back in the 40s. I remember a farewell reception in honor of my friend and colleague, Russian Ambassador Vladimir Lukin in Washington in 1993, and his farewell speech, which I helped him to draft. It was still a good time in our relations, but there was one warning in that whole speech. And he said that the only cloud of danger over the horizon of our relations is if this whole space would turn into a new area of power struggle between Russia and the West. Well, that cloud of danger is now with us. It came with a thunder, but it didn't happen overnight, so let me briefly deal with how both of our countries dealt with the legacy of the Cold War. Let me start with Russia. The changes here have been quite dramatic and obvious. First of all, this asymmetry of power. Russian policymakers are operating from a much narrower base of resources, both in military and economic sense. It's clear. Second, there has been a radical de-ideologization of Russian foreign policy. Gone are messianic pretensions and global aspirations of the Soviet times. Also gone is the old ideological vision of the world. Third, Russia has radically downscaled its military and security requirements. It doesn't aspire anymore to have a military capability equal to all of its real and potential enemies. The current agenda of Russian foreign and security policies is rather modest and limited. Its primary task is to secure the borders and to have stable, friendly, or at least neutral governments in the neighboring countries. While encouraging economic and security cooperation with its neighbors, Russia doesn't want to recreate the Soviet Union, not to speak of the Soviet Empire. So I think the fears of the Russian aggression by Finns, Swedes, and Baltics, and the Poles, which you alluded to, vastly exaggerated. Russia has no intention, from what I know, no capability to present any real threat to the security of those countries. Now, a few words about how we see the Western policies evolving during those post-Cold War years. First of all, while in Russia there is this end of ideology, so to speak, on the Western side we see a real renaissance of liberal democratic crusade going on, a strong reaffirmation of Western values and a new search to expand them to the new virgin lands in the East. This triumphalism, in my view, is being fed by several factors. First is proclaimed victory in the Cold War and drastic decline of alternatives to markets and democracy. End of history by Fukuyama. Second is the progress of globalization, which is seen as essentially westernization or Americanizations of the world, which makes it more friendly and comfortable for the United States, first of all. Third factor is this asymmetry of power. which we already mentioned. The checks and balances of the Cold War, which was a system of checks and balances, I agree, is gone. And now the United States and its allies concluded that they can transform the world to their liking without any opposition from any other great power. There is also something I would call a revolution of democratic expectations. That is, the fewer undemocratic states remain in the world, the more abnormal they seem, and the more intolerant West becomes of their existence, especially if they inhabit strategically important points of the world. As Alexis de Tocqueville in his classical Democracy in America wrote, the democratic passions burn most fiercely when they have least fuel. Most Russians, especially our military planners, from what I know, see this United States-led democratic crusade as a facade, disguising a far-reaching geopolitical design, filling in power vacuums left by the collapse of the Soviet rule, and turning this huge space into Western sphere of interest, inhabited by relatively small, dependent, pro-Western, pro-American governments. In this sense, I see a clear continuity with the Cold War strategy, even though the containment was officially replaced by the enlargement of democracy. But essentially, the latter, the enlargement, became a follow-up on the former, on the containment. After the successful containment and retraction of Soviet power, came an exploration of that new liberated post-Soviet space. I was in Washington at that time, and I remember the optimistic mood of the early days of Clinton administration, which proclaimed strategic partnership with Russian reform, which was then seen as a key to the whole transformation, not only of Russia itself, but of Russian new neighbors and even Central and Eastern Europe. Soon it became clear that this assistance, which was promised, was of marginal significance, and that the transition itself is turning out to be much more difficult and torturous than expected. Soon after 1993 election to the Russian parliament, when anti-Western and anti-liberal parties made a strong comeback, the emphasis in Washington, as we saw it, began to shift from integrating to containing Russia. It was best expressed by then Secretary of State William Perry, who said that we should hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. It sounds prudent, but if you overdo preparing for the worst and do very little, but hope for the best, you are likely to end up with, according to the logic of self-fulfilling prophecy, with what you feared. That is Russia, which is isolated, hostile, and dangerous. That's basically what happened with this two-track strategy. Integration was highly symbolic, like partial membership in G8 or low-level cooperation with NATO, while containment was quite real, with NATO expansion at the heart of it. There was no lack of warnings about dangerous consequences of this decision to expand NATO, which George Kennan, who already was mentioned here, chief architect of containment, called a tragic mistake and the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision, he said, may be expected to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War and impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. Well, it took some time and some further movement of NATO to the east for the Russian response to crystallize. Encouraged by the legacy of feeble protests and empty threats to draw a red line, Alliance promised that Georgia in 2000, the Alliance promised that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. Top Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin, warned that such a step would be, I quote, a direct threat to Russia and would have most serious consequences for pan-European security. And these were not just words, as we know. This time Moscow reacted quite forcefully and even brutally, making it clear that it would not tolerate NATO presence at the Russian border. The lesson of that Caucasus War should have been obvious to all. In the aftermath of that conflict, a veteran American diplomat, Jack Matlock, warned about further attempts to draw Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. And I quote, "Entering a military alliance that Russia considers hostile would increase Russian incentives to subject them to political and economic pressure. NATO membership could even lead to a split of the Ukrainian state from within, since Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the east and south, including especially in the Crimea, do not wish to be in an alliance that Russia opposes." End of quote. Matlock was even more far-sighted about Crimea, and I cite again, "Ukrainian membership in NATO would cause the residents of both the Crimea and Russia to demand a return of the peninsula to Russia. Given the ethnic composition of the population and the economic value of the Russian base, it's likely that the Crimean population would opt for Russia if given the chance." So the recent events in Crimea should not have come as a complete surprise. Yet, the lesson hasn't been learned. NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine remained on the agenda. At the same time, all Russian attempts to offer some alternative to a NATO EU-centered system, which excluded Russia, have met with benign neglect at best. Boris Yeltsin, early Vladimir Putin, raised the possibility of Russia joining NATO. In the beginning of his first presidency, Putin also proposed a new close relationship between Russia and the EU. Also ignored were Russian initiatives to work out a new inclusive system of European security. Perhaps the last chance to do so before the current crisis was Dmitry Medvedev's proposal to conclude a new treaty of European security, which would include NATO as well as new integrated structures built around Russia. This could have stabilized the existing status quo and stopped destructive struggle to redraw spheres of interest. But this chance was also lost. In the meantime, Russia recovered from its post-Soviet decline and ill-conceived economic reforms of the 90s to become a resurgent regional power, I agree, with new self-confidence and political will to defend its core strategic interests. So when the Ukrainian eruption came, the ground was set for a real confrontation. No responsible Russian leader could have ignored a coup in Kiev supported by the West with a clear aim to turn this number one Russian neighbor into a Western outpost. For Russia, Ukraine is not just another neighboring country. We share common history, ancestry, culture, religion. We have countless human kinship and economic ties. We have almost 2,000 kilometers of common border that serves as a gateway to Russia's heartland. As Nicholas Gvozdev from the United States Naval War College put it in his recent article, and I cite, quote, "The worst nightmare of the Russian General Staff would be NATO forces deployed all along this frontier, which would put the core of Russia's population and industrial capacity at risk of being quickly and suddenly overrun in the event of any conflict." End of the quote. I'm certain that American military planners would be even more troubled have they found themselves in a similar situation. As Chicago University professor John Mearsheimer writes in Foreign Affairs, "Imagine the outcry in Washington if China built an impressive military alliance and tried to include Canada and Mexico into it." As a historian, I can't resist the temptation of looking into some old American strategy documents of the Cold War era. Back then, in the late 40s, there were cool heads in Washington who understood what was at stake for Russia in Ukraine. Let me cite this memorandum by National Security Council, which is called United States Objectives with Respect to Russia, which for the first time formulated two basic goals of containment of the Cold War, which was then repeated in later documents of American policy and strategy. And that document, there was a whole section devoted to future what would happen to the Soviet Union after the fall of the Soviet system. Special attention being given to Ukraine. And the authors of the document said, I cite, "Ukraine is not a clearly defined ethnical or geographic concept. There is no clear dividing line between Russia and Ukraine, and it would be impossible to establish one. In economic sense, the economy of the Ukraine is inextricably intertwined with that of Russia as a whole. To attempt to carve it out of the Russian economy and to set it up as something separate would be as artificial and as destructive as an attempt to separate the Corn Belt, including the Great Lakes industrial area, from the economy of the United States. So the authors of that document, when we were planning the post-Soviet future, recommended to have a federation between Russia and Ukraine. But the American planners were realistic enough to understand that it may happen so that Ukraine would become independent even without American involvement by itself, in which case they recommended to assume a neutral position. I cite again, not commit ourselves to their support in a line of action which in long term could probably be maintained only with our military assistance, end of quote. That basically was the point which George Bush Sr. made in his Kiev's chicken speech in 1991 before Ukrainian referendum, in which he warned against what he called suicidal nationalism. Ukrainians didn't follow Bush's advice then, and Ukraine became independent. I would remind you that it was done in the same democratic way by referendum as it was the case with Crimea. But then nobody questioned the legitimacy of that action, and Russia herself respected the will of Ukrainian people with rare, I would say, magnanimity. So since the Cold War, the American policy deviated from those prudent recommendations and took the stand of open encouragement of pro-American forces on post-Soviet space and cultivation of political regimes loyal to the United States. So, as a result now, many in the West are ready to turn Ukraine into an instrument of containing Russia. This, in my view, is a main danger now for all sides, including the West and Ukraine, and Russia too, of course. Such a course may not only lead to a dangerous military confrontation in Europe, but also irrevocably split Ukraine itself. The danger is understood by those in the West who realize what is at stake. Early in the current crisis, Henry Kissinger wrote, "If Ukraine is to survive and thrive, it must not be either side outpost against the other. It should function as a bridge between them. To treat Ukraine as a part of East-West confrontation would scuttle for decades any prospect to bring Russia and the West, especially Russia and Europe, into a cooperative international system." That's why I fully agree with what Mr. Ambassador said about the necessity of bringing all sides together in finding a common solution, one of which, a possibility in my view, would be a neutral status of Ukraine guaranteed by all sides involved. I realize, and it was said here, that integrating Russia into European structures is impossible now, but it cannot remain. It cannot remain forever. It's very important to have the direction in which we are going. And even resolving the current crisis is not going to be easy, given the present atmosphere on both sides and potential credibility damage resulting from a retreat from the current tough positions. The mental legacy of the Cold War, with demonization of the rival and zero-sum game thinking, is still with us. But the experience of the real Cold War also shows that even in critical times, in crisis times, leaders on both sides were able to rise up to the occasion and displayed courage and wisdom to avoid the worst. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir, and thank you for taking care of our time. Let me just remind ourselves of the key points of your talk. You refer to the differences between the two situations, the Cold War and now. You refer to the continuity in certain senses, including the geopolitical rivalry. And then you looked at the legacy of the Cold War in the two countries, claiming that Russia retreated while the West is still pushing forward as far as its ideological crusade is concerned, and also policy of containment as represented in the case of the Ukraine. And you looked at a possible solution by bringing all sides together and referring to the wisdom that is needed in critical times. And our final speaker for this session is going to be Mr. John O'Sullivan, who is the director of the Danube Institute, which is an independent, non-partisan, center-right political think tank here in Budapest, but with an international edge to it. And John was a political advisor and speechwriter to the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1987 and 88, and even after that he served informally as a regular speechwriter for her. And he worked in a number of positions as political commentator for different journals, radio stations, and author of book publications, including his famous 260 book, The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister, which is, in a way, an overall assessment of how the Cold War was ended by the three leaders. And he is going to talk today about the topic, is the post-Cold War period over? John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me begin by thanking you and the other speakers, and also for thanking the József Antall Knowledge Center. I think that this conference and the range of views represented at it are a tribute to the open-mindedness and intellectual integrity of the centre, and I, among others here today, was very privileged to be present last night at the presentation of the award to President Lech Wałęsa of Poland. And I think it worth marking here that the relationship between also the Antall family and Poland is a good one. Not only was President Wałęsa both as a person and as a symbol of the East Europeans struggling to be free in the end of the Cold War period. But of course, Mr. Antall's, Prime Minister Antall's father in the 1940s was someone who protected and looked after the interests of the Poles who'd fled from the Nazis and the communists in that time. Also, as a Brit might mention, among the people who were given sustenance by him and protected were those British flyers who British prisoners of war who managed to make their way to Hungary. Now, having said that, let me just begin by saying that I find myself in the position of someone half of whose views have already been expressed by others on the panel, and the other half of my views have been attacked by other members of the panel. So I'm going to have to edit as I go. I want to begin by making a concession. I do think it is true that for some of us the Cold War is in some sense an occasion of nostalgia, as a time when we think that there was, or we believe there was, more international stability than at present. And I would like to respond to one of the points later that was made by Professor Kramer, because I think I'm largely in sympathy with what he says, but I think there's one corrective I'd like to make. But certainly that period originally begins as one of bipolar stability. The Yalta world was a world in which you could divide everything into three. There was the communist world, there was the free world, and there was the third world. But the third world was defined by the Cold War. It was those countries which were not either in the communist world or the free world. If you were outside those three worlds, you were really outside of history. And some countries did manage to be outside of history. They managed to avoid commitment of any kind. But then, of course, like Trotsky, as Trotsky's example of war demonstrates, history, you may not be interested in history, but history is interested in you. And countries like Cambodia, which tried to stay out, nonetheless found themselves dragged into conflicts. That stability was not in all respects a bad thing. But after for example, after Cuba, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was, I agree, a very dangerous time and could have led to a world catastrophe, it seemed to me the Cold War settled down into a system in which the superpowers waged their conflict, so to speak, through proxies in the middle, in Southern Africa, in the Middle East, in Vietnam. They were, but this was also, these conflicts were waged directly or indirectly by an ethic of mutual restraint. They very often restrained their allies who would have gone further than the Kremlin or Washington wanted to do. And this led also to a world of constant negotiations. I once, as a journalist, looked up the negotiations that were going on between the Soviet Union and Washington at the time of the small Cold War in the early years of the Reagan period. And there was so much that it would have filled 3 articles simply to list these negotiations, not only on arms control, but in other matters as well. And in general, one could say that both sides respected the deep interests of the other side, even when there was conflict over them. Now, there were victims of this supposed stability, and the main ones were the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. It was required of them that they should remain subservient to Soviet power in order to prevent a Soviet Western a hot conflict. We saw that, of course, in 1953 with the East German Workers' Uprising, in 1956, here above all, I think, in 1956, later in 1968 in the crisis of the Prague Spring. But until 1989 and 1991, these countries had to accept that there were very strong limits to their independence at home and abroad, to the degree, to a remarkable degree, and one that we now may find surprising. Now, this ended, of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and its withdrawal from Eastern Europe and Central Europe. We then had a period which, in retrospect, I think looks very good, although obviously it's open to some criticism from other members of the panel. And that is, I think, the post-Cold War period, which lasted from 1989 to 2008. It was marked by, in most circumstances, a rapprochement between Russia and the West, by the development of democratic institutions in all of the countries concerned, although with less stability in Russia itself, by the spread of free market ideas and policies and the erosion of trade barriers in the rest of the world. This was known as neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus, but it brought billions of people onto the world labor market, particularly in Asia, and it led to a sustained period of prosperity, similar to the period of Western prosperity of the 50s and the 60s. It was brought to an end, it seems to me, by 2 events in 2008. The first was the invasion of Georgia. Now, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, there had been warnings of this, particularly at the conference in Bucharest, where Mr. Putin himself just said that Ukraine was not really a real country, and made strong, well, I wouldn't say threats precisely, strong warnings that Ukraine and Georgia should not be admitted to NATO. The EU, by the way, at the time was not a focus of Russian opposition, particularly for the Ukraine. There were suggestions that NATO was one thing, the EU was another. It was after the decision of the NATO not to proceed with the maps to membership at that stage that led to the switch of interest to the expansion of the EU, or rather to its very moderate expansion in the sense of having an association agreement with Ukraine. And the second big event which ended that was the financial crisis, leading to a prolonged world recession. But almost as important as the recession was the loss of self-confidence and morale among Western elites and Western political leaders. They seriously doubted, some of course not altogether reluctantly, they seriously doubted whether the political and economic institutions that had won the Cold War and presided over the following 20 years were worthwhile, were successful, or whether they were open to they had to be substantially and massively reformed. And that led in relation, it led, for example, I think it was one of the factors that meant that the West responded effectively feebly to the invasion of Georgia, or the Russo-Georgian War, which led to the occupation of parts of Georgia. The fact is that the settlement of that war and its endorsement by President Sarkozy was something which, in retrospect, was much less strong a response than the West should have taken. Now, so that was the period. We've now entered another period of great attention. Particularly, I think those two events open the way to the decision, to the Ukrainian crisis. I think a sign of that was the fact that when 22, I think, distinguished Central and East European leaders appealed to the Obama administration in 2009 to play a greater role in Central Europe, to come to the assistance of the Central Europeans, to reaffirm the strong commitment of the United States to their independence and defense. That was first of all publicly opposed by Gerhard Schröder, ex-chancellor of Germany, and led to a very lukewarm response and no real change in policy by the administration. That, of course, followed on, I think, from the reset policy of the Obama administration, which I think is something which has got to be considered here, because it was plainly an attempt by the American administration, as it turned out, a failed attempt, to re-establish good Russo-American relations. Now, that leads me to say, is this new period of tension in which there's a hot war going on at the moment in eastern Ukraine, and in which both sides, in which the Russians are obviously involved on the one hand, and in which the West Europeans and the Americans are plainly giving support to the Ukrainian government on the other, not military support but other kinds. Is this a new Cold War? Well, let me just list a few differences, which I think everyone on the panel seems agreed on this. It isn't a new Cold War. It's not a good thing. It's a dangerous moment in international relations. It's a crisis which has to be resolved in some way, but it's not actually a new Cold War. Well, the first of those differences, it seems to me, is the Soviet Union was a revolutionary power with a semi-religious ideology that had believers throughout the world. You only have to mention such phenomena as the Cambridge spies, or Alger Hiss and those Americans who sympathized with communism and who were at the very top of the American government, to see that there is no similar situation at the moment in world politics. After all, Stalin got the atom bomb earlier than he would have done because of the atomic spies. It's very hard to imagine any similar group of Western intellectuals, scientists or otherwise, giving that kind of assistance to Mr. Putin's regime. No such semi-religious ideology animates the Russian government today. It is less a revolutionary power than an obstructive or anarchic power, breaking some of the international rules and advancing its interests unsystematically. It likes to argue that it likes to challenge the international rules, break them even, but it doesn't have a long-term positive aim in doing so. The nearest embodiment to an ideology that it has, some ideas like, for example, a general concept of authoritarian capitalism, which might unite it with other powers like China. And although it doesn't seem that there are attempts every now and then by intellectuals to get together and have conferences in which they discern common interests and common ideological strains, but that never seems to me to amount to very much. at least at a level of ideas. I think it's interesting. The other ideological idea is really a revival of great power, great Russian national, great Russian neo-imperialism. The idea that all of the Russians, ethnic Russians, should be reunited under the protection of the Russian state. Well, that's not, it seems to me, an argument that can be made. Later on, I'll quickly look at the idea that Russia has spheres of interests. But let me ask you this question. If you accept the spheres of interest argument, what are Germany's sphere of interests? And if Germany asserted the right to intervene in countries where there were Germans living in order to, quote, protect them and to change the policy of the state towards them, would the rest of us not be somewhat alarmed by this? And isn't one of the factors in world politics which has been most conducive to European stability the very fact that Germany, post-war Germany, has made clear now for about 50 years that it has no desire to change either the borders or to assert any kind of protective role for German citizens outside. And this was particularly important in the period 1989 and following, when Helmut Kohl gave very explicit assurances of this kind. So the spheres of interest argument strikes me always as highly dubious. A third final point, and I won't go into detail, and this is of course every now and then you get the impression that the Mr. Putin's regime is acting in defense of a kind of conservative, religiously orthodox Russian nationalism. That's that's put about as a kind of ideology which unites him against the excessive liberalism of the United States and Western Europeans with religious believers and social conservatives in other countries, including this country and elsewhere. I think that the truth of the matter has been well argued on this one by the writer Peter Pomerantsev, who says, in effect, this is a regime which is religiously orthodox in the morning and perfectly liberal in the afternoon, which talks to Wall Street capitalists in a friendly voice in one day, and the next day brings a gathering of religious conservatives in to the Kremlin. It's fundamentally a postmodern, media-savvy regime, which uses its very considerable powers of media technique to win whatever group it's talking to at the time. But these sporadic impulses should not be confused with a serious ideology which shapes decisions. Now, let me turn to the. Oh yes, at one point, I think if you are going to look at protecting the interests of ethnic Russians everywhere, or at uniting them in some, reflecting the emotional and cultural links between them, it would be far better to do this in the way that, let's say, the English-speaking world has informally developed a set of these links, which we now call the Anglosphere, but which mean that that cultural expression of Russianness would be the way to unite people, rather than to think in terms of changing state boundaries or whatever. Now, here's where I'd like to discuss briefly some of the points raised by Professor Kramer, with which I'm in large agreement. The world wasn't as stable in the Cold War as it looked, and many of the tendencies of a disruptive kind we see in this world were present there. I would argue this, really. If we look at the period since 1945, or particularly since 47, we see, I think, the following development. We began with something like a bipolar world. In the early stages of the Cold War, 47 onwards, it really was a unity of the West. There really was, particularly after 47, there really was the consolidation of communist power in countries where either the Red Army existed or which communists dominated in one way or another, and they established a different sort of anti-democratic state. That then gradually crumbled. It begins to crumble with the Sino-Soviet split in 1960, which many people in the West were originally skeptical about. And that is formalized or institutionalized with Nixon's opening to China, where he separates the Chinese from the Soviets, weakening them, it seems to me, considerably at that time, and at the same time giving somewhat greater space in international institutions to other non-Soviet, non-purely Western institutions. You are beginning to move there towards the end of the Cold War to a multipolar world. And then the internal collapse of communism produces a unipolar world. For, as I say, a period of, I would say less than 20 years, but you could certainly say for almost 2 decades. And then the failures of 2008 and the emergence of India and the development of much more successful economies in Asia, such as Indonesia, this leads, and the rise of China, this leads again to a multipolar world. I've got to finish quite quickly. Let me then move to do so. But my main point, not of disagreement but with Professor Kramer, but of kind of a shading of it is, yes, a lot of these disruptive tendencies were present during the Cold War, but it's also true that as the supplier of arms and organizational help, the Soviet Union was able to exercise some restraint on the terrorist movements that we now know that it assisted. Ukraine. It seems to me that the really major change between then and now is the weakness of Russia economically. It's simply not as great a power in the world. The Soviet Union never was as economically successful as the published figures would have suggested, and there were some interesting moments in the Cold War for that reason alone. But it is certainly, we now know the weakness of Russia. We know that it's over-dependent on natural resources. We know it hasn't used the high energy prices of recent years as effectively as it should have done to reform and improve its own economy. And we know about the demographic risks and the oil risks, the risk of falling energy prices confront it with. Fine, all of that's true. But having said that, though Putin is clearly, it seems to me, overextending himself in the Ukraine crisis and presenting Russia with an outcome, with a system with no good outcome. It either has to retreat in some sense in the future, in which case Russia suffers a loss of prestige and influence, or it has to involve itself in a continuing and possibly increasing level of repression to keep, to sustain its position in eastern Ukraine. In other words, the Russians could find themselves, probably not to this extent, with the same kind of discrediting war in eastern Ukraine that so damaged the Americans with their allies in 1968 and onwards with the Vietnam War. That's another element in the changing Cold War, because that undermined the unity of the West quite seriously. And by 1980, when Reagan is coming in, you're getting visitors from West Germany and others to Moscow expressing greater concern about the warmongering Reagan than they are about Soviet policy. So where does this lead us? Well, it seems to me it leads us to the following conclusion, that we have made mistakes with Russia, not, I think, exactly the ones that the previous speaker identified, but nonetheless, in the long run, we have to bring Russia into the institutions of Euro-Atlantic governance. In order to do that, however, their presence has to be acceptable to the Central and Eastern Europeans and to the Balts and to others. And in order for that to come about, the Russians themselves have to seriously abandon any suggestion of a kind of neo-imperial mindset, any suggestion that they have a right to determine either the international loyalties or the internal domestic politics of their neighbors, even those with large numbers of Russian, ethnic Russians in the community. And until that happens, we're going to have a problem with Russia. It won't be a new Cold War, but it will be a period of continuing tension and some unpleasant, disruptive moments.
Thank you, John. And let me just sum up very quickly the main points of your talk. You refer to the nostalgia, in a way reasonable nostalgia, but dangerous as well. You refer to the victims of the Cold War in Eastern and Central Europe, and you refer to a post-Cold War period that was ended in 2008 by the financial crisis, by the invasion of Georgia, and by a loss of belief by Western leaders. And then you analyze the situation at the moment. You realize that there are spheres of interest, but you do not accept the term itself, and you seem to imply in your conclusion that there were mistakes against Russia, but you think that there is a need to invite Russia into a kind of Euro-Atlantic governance, and until then you seem to imply that the conflict is still alive. Now we have to realize what's the order. I suggest to the organizers to be a bit longer than we expected and have about 20 minutes for discussion. Is that okay? It seems to be okay. So I would give the floor first to the speakers, but before that, let me just give you two basic questions which might be relevant here. One is an ideological, one real political question. I think that the ideological question, as far as the panel's speakers pointed out, might be this one. Is the Western sphere, the Western power sphere, in a position to push forward its own ideology, i.e. democratic liberalism, as a global standard, so to say, as a global international standard, or is it something that is a remnant of the Cold War period and that is against the interest of some other powers, including Russia? And this includes the minor question whether the Soviet past should be regarded as a totalitarian past or as something else. And as far as the real political issue is concerned, I think that most of the presentations refer to the problem of stability and asymmetry. And it seems to me that there were two positions. One claiming that while the Cold War in a way stabilized the world, now we are living in an asymmetric world, and that on the first hand does make it impossible to return to the Cold War, but perhaps there is a need for what one of the speakers called checks and balances in the international sphere as well. And the real political issue also includes the question of the new players, whether they will have an influence on this bipolar system, whether there is a possibility for a multipolar system. And that's how far I would like to go. And first now I give the floor to our speakers to comment each other's, if you allow, the first 10 minutes, and then the next 10 minutes would be for questions from the audience. So please.
I actually, I think I can tie these together in a way that I'm primarily responding to Vladimir and to some extent to John. Before 2008, I think it would be very important to underscore one other year because it brought together several things. 1999. And in 1999, NATO as an alliance outside the UN Security Council framework fought a war against Serbia. So after having provided repeated assurances to Russia that NATO was a purely defensive alliance, NATO embarked on what was, whether you regard the war as right or wrong, irrespective of that, it certainly wasn't defensive. It was designed to compel through the bombing of Serbia and of Serb positions in Kosovo to compel a change in Serbian behavior, and eventually led to the carving off of Kosovo from Serbia. So that would be the first thing, which changed the whole nature of NATO enlargement, because NATO, or at least the way it was seen in Moscow, it suddenly, questions began to loom about what NATO really was. Was it what NATO had been assuring? 1999 was also the year year that Russia's recovery from the post-communist economic decline began. So Russia began growing again in 1999. And it made a big difference once Russia, over several years, had a lot more money than it did at any point during the 1990s. It was able to do certain things like to pay people and to field armies and that sort of thing. 1999, though, was equally the shift at the very end of the year from Boris Yeltsin to Vladimir Putin in Russia. And in this particular case, where Russia has had only 2 leaders in the post-Soviet period, because I don't regard Dmitry Medvedev as having been leader when he was president, it shifted from one to the other, and there too, I think cumulatively, it made a very substantial difference in the post-Cold War period. And this leads me then to the other major point that I wanted to highlight on. I think Vladimir gave much too much credence to Putin's remarkably self-serving version of events. When 2013 began, the status of Crimea had basically been settled through a lease that had been negotiated and imposed on with Yanukovych. The thing that really drove Russia's action in this instance had nothing to do with NATO enlargement or anything, because NATO enlargement had ended already. The last countries to come in, Croatia and Albania, came in 2009, and there was nothing more that was going on. As John mentioned, when both Georgia and Ukraine applied in 2008 at the summit in Bucharest. It was turned down, and that was just for a membership action plan, not membership. And their requests were turned down, and that basically marked the end. So the thing that has remained, however, very consistent in Putin's policy over the last 10 years has been one of a counter-revolutionary authoritarianism, where Putin wants to repel any forces that bring about what he describes as color revolutions, as popular upheavals that will get rid of authoritarian leaders. I'm not arguing that that is what happened in Ukraine, but that is certainly I happen to have a lot of grave reservations about what happened in Ukraine. But certainly the way Putin views it is that it was a Western-inspired counter-revolution, and his belligerent stance in Ukraine has been designed to undo that, to humiliate the Ukrainian government, to keep Ukraine unstable until he can assure a return to a regime that he feels more comfortable with. Increasingly, it seems that his actions have backfired to a degree against him, because much of Ukraine now, I think, is permanently
Mark,
lost.
would you mind if we give the floor to Vladimir to react on that?
Okay.
Several quick points in responding to what Mark said. I don't think that the NATO expansion has ended. NATO officially has never closed the door to other members. It's just a matter of time. And I think that was the original sin of the whole project, because once you start this expansion, there's no end. You are ending up with countries in between NATO and Russia who have to choose, and it's either or situation, which is very dangerous. So I don't think that the process has ended. It was emphasized that that the door is still open. About Russia breaking the rules. And that brings us to your question, which is a very philosophical question, whether West has a right to expand its values and principles to the rest of the world. And of course it does. I mean, any country can propagate its principles and ideas. It's all a matter of how you do it. I think it was Toynbee who said that the West is inherently aggressive in the sense that it cannot live without expansion, without getting its message and its credo to the outside world. And in this sense, the Western civilization is offensive in this positive sense. It's all a matter of rules and how you do it. One thing is cultural diplomacy, which was mentioned, and the other thing is, as Mark rightly pointed out, bombing Serbia.
Vladimir, can I ask something?
Yeah.
Would you remind yourself of Russia as belonging to the Western civilization in this point of view or not?
Well, there's no simple answer to this question. As you know, Russia
it's a philosophical
straddles several continents almost, and it belongs, I think, in cultural sense, Russia, of course, is very much a part of the West. And there's no argument about this. But Russia is not just an European country. So that makes it more difficult for Russia, I agree. It's much more difficult to integrate this, such a huge and heterogeneous, with a split identity country into the transatlantic structures and institutions. But on the other hand, if you isolate Russia and if you keep it outside, you are creating an unstable system. That was the lesson of Versailles. And so the dilemma is for both sides. I think West should be more understanding and should make more of an effort to put itself into Russian shoes and to see what moves Putin and other people. I would argue that Putin is not an isolated individual. He is the very popular leader in Russia these days. It says something about the values. I don't think the Russian people is being fooled by Putin, by media. It resonates deep in the Russian psyche these days, for better or worse. I may not agree with that myself. But I see that this message, his policies are genuinely popular now at the moment. And that says something about the Russian mood and the Russian culture and its differences from the West in traditional sense.
Could I invite the other two speakers to react on this one point which was, I think, mentioned by both of them, i.e. that Russia should be brought together with the other European and American powers in a kind of a discussion of the issue when it's so critical as nowadays in Ukraine?
Well, I would say, I think at the end of my talk I suggested that the way for the future is to make plain, as we have done in subdued and low voices, that in the long term Russia might well become a part of the Western Directorate, so to speak, a powerful member of the Euro-Atlantic institutions. And it has had, since '89, a series of halfway houses there. And I think that is something that has got to be always stressed. I also think we've got to stress that our respect and indeed affection for the Russian people, and I would go further than either of anyone else on the panel so far in asserting Russia is a European power. There's no doubt about that. I mean, a European civilization without Tolstoy and without the music of Shostakovich, Tchaikovsky, and others is unthinkable. I mean, it's just we're talking. This is a very serious dispute, but it's a serious dispute within a cultural family, and we have to bear that always in mind, and we have to, in a sense, hold out as a long-term prospect a kind of political situation which corresponds to this cultural situation. Now, the difficulty there, it seems to me, is let me draw an example. Quite a lot of the world was conquered and became part of the British Empire by London at the same time as Russia was expanding. And the question is, and if you look at the relationship now between England and countries, not only countries like Canada and Australia, but also countries like India, you will see that culturally speaking, we probably have far more influence in all of those countries than we had at the certainly in India would be a good case here, than we had at the height of British imperial power. That was accomplished by surrendering that power. The first example being, I think, the Treaty of Paris, when we acknowledge the independence of America. It took some time, but at the end of the day, the cultural links were sufficiently strong that we we now function in ways that those countries are not foreign to Britain in the same way that, say, a marvelous country like Italy is. It's a different country.
Thank you, John. I think
I think Russia has got to move in the same direction.
The discussion alive. Let me give the floor to András just to refer to what he thinks is important in this respect.
Thank you. I'm in a very pleasant position because all the speakers gave us really a good lesson. So at least I had a chance to learn a lot of things. And first, of course, I cannot comment everything because it is not the task of this panel. I was very much impressed by Mark's very clear statement concerning the continuity in the way that actually we are faced with very similar challenges even today. As you said very rightly, that a lot of challenges were present during the classical years of Cold War, as terrorism, for example. You are absolutely right. And your examples are convincing. At the same time, we must see the differences between the two periods, the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. We are not able even to name correctly this last period. So we say that when we say that post this or that, it is similar that in philosophy, as you know, that when post this or that,
postmodern.
Yes, postmodern, for example, it means that we are not able to give the definition properly. But the problem is that the United States have never been faced with the same challenges of terrorism during the Cold War as today. September 11, I think that did not have the precedence. Of course, when you enlisted, a lot of terrible and dirty terrorist attacks, the Black September and the Japanese Red Army and so on. So we can give a lot of examples. I think that so far nobody so directly and straightly threatened the security of America, and even psychologically this influence was a terrible thing. During the Cold War, mainly a lot of science fictions dealt with similar attacks on America. So that's a new phase, and we must see that, of course, we hope that nothing will repeat it, but at the same time, it is a fact that these kind of attacks are more and more sophisticated and cheaper.
Thank you, András. I think it was a strong point, and let's give the floor to the audience. We can collect, say, 4 questions because we have 4 speakers, and let's have them short and addressed to one or the other of the speakers. We have got a microphone, so you can talk into it.
Thank you.
And we collect it all, and then you can react on that.
Mészárovics, működik? Igen. Mészárovics Tamás vagyok. I'm Mészárovics Tamás, a pensioner of the Foreign Ministry. Has Putin complained that he didn't get the stuff what he had paid $5,000 million for? No, it was Victoria Nuland. Where did this money for? To the pocket of East Ukrainian people? No. To the pocket of West Ukrainian people from Galicia, right on the Polish-Slovakian-Hungarian border. $100 per day. Did Russian diplomats crowd the Maidan Square like if they were doing their weekly shopping there? No. Western diplomat did that. And another fact, now from the Arabic world, Saudi Arabia and Qatar is against the Islamic world. Did anybody ask him that few months ago, why had they give considerably financial aid to the same organization? Concluding, concluding, in the old Rome they asked, in the classic Rome, cui prodest? Who was interested in it? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Sándor Földvárja, historian, and my question concerns East Europe a bit more briefly. I've just returned from the fourth Congress of the Belarusian Studies, was held in Lithuania, in Kaunas. It's well known to us why it is more comfortable to organize a Congress in a neighboring country, as a Congress of Hungarian Studies would be organized in Austria, for instance. And there I've read, and that concerns my question, there I've read a paper, I'm not speaking about my paper, but there I've read a journal of Belarusian studies in field of political sciences, when an author wrote about a topic that is it a real risk for Lithuania that Lukashenko want to attack this neighboring country or not? The question is not is it a serious question or not, because it was analyzed in that paper. But my question after this, that there are some regional conflict zones, some regional conflict situations. And we are speaking about conflicts in the macro structure of the world. And the question is that to what extent this sharp situation or conflict situation in the macro structure of the world could urge local conflict.
Thank you. Next question, please. And that's the last one, actually.
Okay, my name is János Kávasi, I'm a historian.
Hello.
A very simple question to all the members of the panel. Why is Russia focusing on the West instead of China? Because several years ago we had the Chinese premier in a news conference together with Mr. Putin saying that he was willing to send settlers to Russia, exactly to Siberia, to oil-rich Siberia. Thank you.
Thank you. You have got the questions. I wonder how you will react on that.
Let me start with the last question.
Sure.
About Putin, China, and the West. I don't think that Putin is focusing entirely on the West. He is angry with the West, that's a different matter. But in his real policy, he is, of course, extending his hand to the East. And growing ties with China, as you know, visits, diplomacy, and so forth. So he is looking for some other avenues for Russia. As for this Chinese offer to inhabit Siberia and the Far East with the Chinese, it sounds to me a bit more problematic. I don't think Putin was happy about this. But this is an old Chinese, I think, fantasy or dream, which who knows someday may come true.
Yes, I more or less agree with that. It seemed to me when you looked at, obviously in the short term, Putin would like to have good relations with the Chinese because he's having a conflict with the West. The Chinese will drive a hard bargain because their long-term interests are somewhat different to his. And indeed, if you turn from the op-ed pages of the newspapers to the business pages, and when reporting on the deal that he reached with the Chinese over gas supplies, you will see that the Chinese drove a very hard bargain indeed, because they were taking advantage of his weakness at the time. So there are limits to that kind of game. And also, I agree with with Professor Balog in his initial remarks, with the Chinese are not going to be able to play quite the role that the Soviet Union played in the future for all sorts of reasons. And one final point. I think if you look at the Ukraine crisis, and that relates to the first question, if you look at the Ukraine crisis, what you see is the Ukrainian people played a much bigger part than the Europeans in it. The Europeans, first of all, didn't want to have the deal in Bucharest. That's why there wasn't a deal over expanding NATO. Secondly, the EU was not particularly keen to have Ukraine in. There were people in it like Radek Sikorski and Carl Bildt who were, but the rest of them were even Steven and were really fairly lukewarm. It was the Ukrainians who wanted the deal. The Ukrainians who wanted the deal included the previous president, Yanukovych. It was as a result of strong pressure from Russia that the government withdrew its agreement to the association agreement. And that produced a riot in the streets, and that led to the overturning of the government. And your argument on that has been, in a sense, outdated. Whatever the democratic credentials of the Maidan, and I think that they're better than you do, whatever you think of them, the fact is the elections since that time have established a government that clearly has the support of the voters and the people and clearly has legitimacy. So you have to deal with that fact now, and rather than refighting the battles over the Maidan.
Just very, very quickly on, with regard to China, China is very well integrated into the world economic system. It even is in organizations like the WTO that it really isn't qualified to join because it still systematically violates some of the provisions, but it gets away with that. China also it has a highly authoritarian system, and this is where, even though the US messianic impulse that was described sometimes does produce very undesirable results. It never really has pushed hard with China. It has never pushed Saudi Arabia, which is extraordinarily repressive and authoritarian. So even there you have to understand there are a lot of qualifications to some of the generalizations that have been put forth. With regard finally to the question about actions in Europe. Again here, I think you have to look for patterns of behavior over time. Putin has been consistently opposed to popular unrest that leads to the removal of authoritarian governments, starting really with Serbia in 2000 and continuing on through Georgia and then Ukraine in 2004. In Kyrgyzstan, 2005, and so forth. So there's a great deal of continuity there, and that's where I see his response to events in Ukraine as having been driven by what was going on in Ukraine, which was a challenge to this whole counter-revolutionary authoritarian ethos. NATO enlargement was pure window dressing.
Thank you. Just if you have a final word, András.
Sorry, I didn't want to make the final statement. Not at all. This kind of privilege I don't need. But since this is a security conference in a way, please remember that the victims of the Cold War or post-Cold War period are mainly the Central and East European nations, because here not the integration but the disintegration processes have been vital. Please look at the disintegration of three of our neighbors, for example. I mean the Hungarian neighbors. I mean the former Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. What is the consequence we have to meet as a challenge every day? Look at the so-called frozen conflicts in Central and Eastern Europe. Look at Bosnia and Kosovo. So these are the problems we are directly concerned. So let us not forget about, of course, China is of course more important, of course, in the global network. But here in our region, we see that there is not any final settlement. Even we are not nearing to any kind of solution. So we cannot make any order, we cannot leave this area, at the same time, we don't know even the main frameworks of any kind of settlement. Thank you.
Well, that was a nice final word because it did not finish the discussion. I think that the Cold War is still the topic for hot debates, and I'm sure that you will have the same in the afternoon and tomorrow. And let's turn now to the coffee and the lunch. I'm happy that I was here, and I'm looking forward to the next panels. Thank you.